appreciate you being the first one to use it with me.
No worries.
I think we should be good. But yeah, I appreciate it. You're located in Florida right now?
Yes, I'm in Miami. We have offices in both Europe and the U.S., so I kind of cycle back and forth.
Amazing. I was taking a look at your LinkedIn, and I was taking a look at Userlytics the other night, and it looks like you have a very interesting history. Of you were working in Madrid, and you were working in uh, a nuclear plant at a period of time,
Yes,
and
yes,
and in Japan as well,
correct.
or
Yes,
for a Japanese company, if I'm not mistaken.
not for a Japanese company. It was actually a French company, and I started my own business also there in Japan. So yeah, I was in Japan for 5 years.
That's amazing. Yeah. So, I mean, the reason that I wanted to reach out to you, and the live stream is going right now. So, we're broadcasting on both Instagram, Facebook, and on LinkedIn Live. And um, I wanted to reach out because you had such an interesting history in terms of uh, what you've been doing and what you've been doing with Userlytics. And I just love hearing stories about entrepreneurs, and I love hearing their journey. As an entrepreneur myself, I'm always curious about what people have been going through in order to build up their business.
Hmm.
So if you don't mind, just like giving me a little bit of background about what your schooling was like and what brought you to Userlytics.
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, I've had somewhat of a varied background. I started in the U.S. Navy, actually. Went on to work as an engineer in various nuclear power plants across the United States. Did an MBA in France, and then went to Japan and got involved in the telecom industry. Went back to Spain and co-founded a number of operators, a mobile operator and a fixed operator. And yeah, when I sold those two companies in 2006, after taking a little bit of a break, I I started working on something that was I had no intention of building Userlytics. The idea was completely different, and it was supposed to be a B2C social media company. Um, I built up two teams in Europe and the US. We started working, we did a launch, and it became immediately obvious that either I was going to have to pour in a lot more funding into the venture or it was not going to work as contemplated. So before just shutting down, I got together with the entire team and I just shared with them the situation and I asked if they had any ideas. And one of them said, well, why don't we get into the field of usability testing, which at that time, it was just starting to emerge the possibility of doing remote user experience testing and remote usability testing. So we looked into it, we liked what we saw, and we jumped head first, and here we are.
That's amazing because even with building your own business, it's not usually for everybody. It takes a certain kind of personality and a certain kind of character to make that. Were you always that entrepreneur type, or did that come with time?
I, I guess I must have been because I do remember when I was 14, I was living in a small town in Spain, and I convinced a supermarket to do a joint venture with me where we would do, uh, you know, remote grocery shopping. Basically, mobile phones didn't exist or the internet was not around.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I started that business. It didn't go far, I have to say, um, but um, but I guess I must have liked the idea of starting ventures because it started at that age.
That's amazing. And yeah, not to jump around too much, but I did want to go in a little bit more into your history because coming from like the U.S. Navy and then working as in a Japanese telecommunication company was like a pretty big leap. How did you make that transition? And even what started you from like the U.S. Navy to making the big leap into telecommunications?
Yeah, well, I was doing quite well in the nuclear power industry. After the U.S. Navy, I
Mm.
joined big company, Bechtel Power Corporation, and I worked with them in D.C. and Mississippi and Kansas, and then I went to Ohio. I was working for another nuclear power plant. Um, but I kind of decided I wanted to diversify away from just pure engineering type work, and
Mm.
and I was very lucky in a sense because a few months after I left the nuclear power industry and I went to Europe and started getting ready to do an MBA, the accident at Chernobyl happened, and you know that was icing on the cake on top of the 3 Mile Island incident in the late 70s. So the nuclear power industry went into a deep freeze for many decades after that. Um, anyway, did my MBA, and at that time Japan was very much in the news. And I was very curious. I visited it. I liked what I saw, and I decided I wanted to learn more. So I went there, and I had to find a living. So it wasn't that easy to find a job in a country where I didn't speak the language. The culture was completely different. So the easiest path for me was really starting a business, which I did, and then had a joint venture with a Japanese market research firm, and eventually ended up managing the Tokyo division of a French market research consultancy. So that's how that all happened.
Perfect. And you touched a little bit before. Now, just getting into the Userlytics part of it. You touched a little bit before about how you started Userlytics, but was there just one moment that sparked the idea to move forward with it, or was it just like an accumulation of small things that happened?
A lot of times when founders are interviewed and asked about what led them to create their company, they will retroactively adjust the story and come up with some kind of mythology. I was in a bar, I was drinking, and I thought it would be great if we invented glasses, and then I had the idea for glasses, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't like doing that. The truth is, the idea for Userlytics came from the team that I managed. And I like empowering teams. I like creating an atmosphere where people enjoy going to work. And when they get up in the morning, they're not thinking, oh my God, I have to work today, but rather they're excited about going to work and collaborating with their other team members. And this idea came from one of the team members. Where she got it from, I don't know, but we looked into it and we liked it, and then we started experimenting. And at the end of the day, what really matters, in my view, in entrepreneurship is not so much the initial idea, but how you execute on it over time. The small tweaks and changes you have to make to your business model, your pricing model, your organization, who you hire, your ICP, everything.
No, for sure. And even I love interviewing founders as well, like founders and CEOs, because they start building things like from the ground up, and they kind of like know what it's like to be like in the trenches and having to pay people on payday and just figuring out all the logistics rather than there's an art as well to like coming in and managing teams. But when you're like building it from the trenches, it just like takes a whole new mentality than already coming in and like building in a managing a well-oiled machine.
Yes, it's completely different. It has its pluses and its minuses.
For sure.
A lot more stress involved, but once I like to say that there's 3 stages in any entrepreneurial journey. Stage 1 is excitement, joy. We're doing this, fantastic. Stage 2 is journey through the valley of the shadow of death. It's basically and most startups stop at stage 2. That's the reality.
Mm-hmm.
And then stage 3 is you've got product market fit, you've got cash flow positive, you're growing quickly, and that's a great place to be. So yeah,
For sure.
Pass through phase 2.
No, for sure, for sure. A lot of people, I think, wish that they could just pass over that valley of death part, but
Sure.
I think that also a really big thing about it. I think I'm sure the same for you, but while I was like building out my business too, it helps change you also, not only as an entrepreneur, but I think also as a person that you feel like you can endure a lot more than you actually thought that you could. Did you find the same?
I totally agree with you that it changes who you are, and I think every person's journey is different. But um, in my case, it really brought to light how important the corporate culture is, how important the team is. And, once you start getting that virtuous circle where you've got rock stars in your team and that attracts other rock stars and it makes other people enjoy working with that team and so on and so forth, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But to get to that point is difficult, but that changes you too as a leader and as a manager, um, because then you have to adapt to these strong personalities that you've hired. They have their own ideas, and what you don't want to do is to be an obstacle in the path of the success of your team. Let them go and reap the glory, as it were.
Yeah, no, that's one of the beautiful things too, that you hire people that are like good in certain areas that you might not necessarily be the best in, and then they can also you kind of have to like rise to those levels as yourself and with the rest of the company.
Exactly. It's always difficult to know which areas you should delegate and which areas you should roll up your sleeve and really dive deep into. And my own preference in that regard is any area that I know how it works well. For example, I don't know, sales and marketing, um, delegate. And any area that you don't know so well, that is a little bit of a black box, maybe, you know, uh, coding, for example, dive in and really get into the nitty gritty. So that's the way I approach it. I don't know if it's the right way or not, but yeah.
No, I definitely agree with that. And it's hard the first times that you're working on something because it's your baby. Or at least in my opinion, in my experience, it's your baby, and it's like hard to like let things go for other people to do. So you're like, no, I can do it better, but like sometimes you just can't.
Right.
There's other people out there who are better at you in certain areas. So when you were starting off too, uh, I'm always interested in like the early phases. How did you get your initial clients, and how has your like product evolved from getting your initial clients to where you are now years later?
Yeah, that's a great question because it took us a while to figure out who our ICP, our ideal customer profile was. Um, so when we launched this, we thought initially, uh, almost instantaneous qualitative feedback and insights. I'm sure the developers will love this while they're developing their apps and their prototypes and their websites and what have you, especially at that time, the emerging agile phenomenon. This is perfect for an agile mindset. That was not the ICP. So we spent a lot of money and effort trying to sell to those kinds of people, and it didn't work. Then we thought, okay, this is kind of similar to market research. I bet you that market researchers will love this. So we focused on them. That didn't work either. Uh, then we thought, well, the marketing folks, they would love to be able to really see their customers and their users interacting with their products and their collateral in real time. But that turned out not to be the ICP either. So, until we found who the ICP was, it was like pushing a boulder up a hill. It was very strenuous work and very hard. But then when we finally figured it out, then all of a sudden, people were knocking on our door. We were not knocking on their door. So, the whole thing shifted. And I guess the lesson of that is that you need to experiment constantly until you find out who is your ICP, and that's crucial.
For sure, and especially in the early days. Um, did you ever have this? Because now this is more like a personal question for my own experience. I was so hesitant about like nailing down the ICP because I was like, especially when you're bootstrapping everything, you're like, no, like if someone's like offering me to pay for my service or to pay for my product, then it's like it's money on the table, and it's really hard to say no. Was it ever difficult for you, or were you like, no, we have to get our ICP?
Um, that's a great question because, you know, you could make the argument that if somebody's paying for your service, that is one of the strongest indication that maybe that is the ICP. You know, they're willing to pay for the service. Um, we recently did an analysis of a cohort analysis of different segments within our customer base, and one of the things we discovered was that the vast majority of our profitability was driven by just one of our three segments. But then, at first glance, that might mean, okay, stop serving segment 1 and 2 because only segment 3 is profitable. But we dug in a little bit deeper and we discovered that, yes, segment 1 and 2 are not profitable per se, but they're very easy to onboard. It's almost self-service, and they help subsidize the acquisition cost of segment 3. And so we kept on serving segment 1 and 2, and that continues to this day. So if somebody's willing to pay you money, that's a really strong signal that, that's telling you something. Now, what you have to look at is what's the cost of you delivering that service or that product. And if it turns out that it's not profitable, still maybe it's worthwhile if they're subsidizing, as in our case, the cost of acquisition of another segment. But you also have to ask yourself, is it scalable? If I multiply by 10, will the cost curve and the revenue curve go up in parallel, in which case it's not really scalable? Or will the revenue curve go up like this and the cost curve go up like this, in which case it is scalable? So those are the kinds of things that I would ask myself in that kind of scenario.
No, perfect. And speaking of the topic of even having different features and having different services, is there a certain strategy? You kind of touched on it a little bit, but I just want to know if you had like any more advice for that. Is there a certain way that you take certain features and just rapidly test them or rapidly improve them?
Right. So that's a great question, because the agile and lean startup mindset would be to do exactly that. And in fact, that is what we did for many years. We would roll out new services and new capabilities, new features, and test the waters, and then tweak them. That worked for a while, but there is a cost to that. More than one, in fact. But one of the costs was, is the usability of what you're delivering good enough? Is the user experience good enough? So what can happen is you've got a ton of features, but they're not sufficiently polished, and that over the long term will start hurting you. And then at a technical level, and this applies to software, it may mean that you create a lot of what is known as technical debt because of the way that you built these new capabilities. So it's a trade-off, and I would argue that at certain points in the journey of the company, it is the right way to go about things. And at other points, when you've achieved a certain scale, you may need to step back and say, okay, before launching new features and new capabilities, let's refactor the design and the development of all of our main features to make sure it has a fantastic user experience. We like to say that, paraphrasing Peter Drucker a little bit, we like to say that user experience eats strategy for breakfast. If you have a good user experience, that beats everything else.
Amazing. And one of the points that you touched on was the technical debt, which I found was interesting. I've never heard the term before, and I've been in engineering for well, I was in engineering for 3 years beforehand. So for the technical folks who are listening, how would you describe what technical debt is?
Sure. So imagine that your marketing people or your product people or your salespeople come to you and say, "Hey, there's this great opportunity if we add this feature to our system or this capability," and they convince you, and you rapidly develop it, but you do it in such a way that it starts creating kind of like spaghetti code because the original code was not designed with that kind of capability in mind. And so you were faced with the choice of, do I rewrite and refactor my entire code of this part of the platform, or do I just do some workarounds and use this kind of spaghetti code to just make it work?
Mm,
A lot of the times we'll do the latter because we're in a hurry. We want to get this out fast. And so you do that once, you do that twice, you do that 3 times, you do that 4 times. And after a while, things start breaking more easily. Bugs appear more easily. You change something, but because you had forgotten that there was a connection between that feature and this other database over here, that makes this other capability stop working, and so on and so until you finally come to the realization, okay, we have a lot of technical debt here. We need to refactor the whole thing. And it doesn't mean that you made a mistake initially. It's just that at different moments in the journey, different tactics and strategies may be called for.
no, that's fair. That was a little nostalgic too for me because I think even as a junior developer, we were in charge of maintaining legacy code, and maintaining legacy code is such a hassle because,
Right.
like you said, you change one thing, you change one line of code, and then something else breaks, and you don't know like why it broke, and you're like trying to go into that rabbit hole.
Right.
So it's a fair point, and it brought me down some not so great memories with that one. Um, in terms of people that want to start their own software as a service company, is there any advice that you would give people who have an idea and who want to take it to fruition?
Well, I guess generically, and not just for the SaaS business, but um, I would say that things are changing so rapidly with artificial intelligence and everything else that I would proceed cautiously. So um, there are not that many business models out there where there's a winner take all type of structure. You could argue that Facebook is a good example of a winner take all because of the network effects. Everybody uses Facebook because everybody uses Facebook, and thus it becomes difficult for a new entrant like a Blue Sky, although they seem to be doing well, to compete with that. But most businesses are not like that. In most business industries, there is room for multiple entrants. So um, trying to be faster than everybody else and say, okay, now we're going to scale up in a big way and we're going to hire a bunch of people and we're going to spend a bunch of money on advertising. We're going to do this and we're going to do that. That's, in my view, always a mistake. It's always very tempting, but it's always a mistake. It's better to, the example of the hare and the turtle, right? It's better to be like the turtle and just incremental progress, and not scale up things before their time. So that would be a generic piece of advice. Um, yeah, I don't know if that is helpful.
No, it definitely was because I think a lot of times we also look at the competition and we also look at like well I'll speak for myself. I look at people like who are sometimes even like younger than me and they're like at significantly higher levels in their career and we're like we got to get to that place and we have to scale and sometimes the thing isn't even ready to
Right.
necessarily scale. So
Exactly.
having the good foundation is super key, and also noticing that Yeah, there's definitely areas. It's not like a winner take all situation. There's definitely room for people in the pie. Um, in terms of major lessons that you've learned, I'm gonna leave this one like very very broad. It doesn't necessarily have to be Userlytics, but um, it could be. But are there any major lessons that you've learned throughout your career?
Sure. There's one, there's a few, but one of them is timing. Timing is so important. And I'll give you an example. Um, the telecom firms that I founded in the late 90s, one was fixed line, the other was wireless. Um, in the late 90s, at the top of the dot com bubble, um, I started receiving offers, and an industrial firm came and offered to buy. At that time, I had a 10% stake in the venture. Offered to buy my venture for $400 million. This happened at the same time that investment banks like um, Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley were telling us that we could do an IPO and that it would be worth 1.6 or 1.5 billion dollars. So I'm like, oh, 400 million. What do you think? What are you trying to do here? And um, so then the bubble burst. We were in the middle of preparing for an IPO. The IPO was canceled. Um, then our parent company started to run out of money. I found some saviors of our business, and I got them to make an offer valuing the company at 450 million. That was turned down by my majority shareholder. Then I repeated the process a few months later with some other firms, and the offer was $250 million, and they turned that down. And then it was like the bid and the ask kept on going down in parallel, but they never joined. Finally, the last offer was made in March of 2001 for $80 million. It was not accepted, and the parent company went into bankruptcy. Now, when that happened, I went ahead and purchased the shares that I did not own for €1. So, in the space of 1 year, the valuation of the company had gone from $1.5 billion to €1.
Oh
Now,
my gosh.
I proceeded to then restructure the company. Um, Unfortunately, many people had to be laid off. We had to stop a lot of investments. We had to do this, we had to do that. But 3 years later, no, actually, 5 years later, sold the company for a very decent amount. Nowhere near the amounts that we've been talking about before, but a very nice exit. So I guess the main lesson there is valuations can really change based on factors that are completely outside of one's control. So timing is super important. Userlytics is another good example. When we launched, we were talking earlier about finding the ICP and everything else. The first 3, 4, 5 years of Userlytics existence, very, very difficult. Going through that phase 2, the valley of the shadow of death. And then all of a sudden, everything clicked. Everything worked. We had found our ICP. That was partially because of things we did, but it was also largely because the market itself shifted. All of a sudden, user experience optimization stopped being this very niche, invisible activity within large corporates, and the CEOs of large enterprise started realizing that, hey, user experience is important. We should put more money into that. We should invest in that. And all of a sudden, everything became much easier for us. So again, timing is everything. So if I had to advise myself at a young age, I would say, keep your powder dry, because if things don't work now, it's possible it's just a timing issue, and things will work 6 months from now, 2 years from now, or whatever. So don't spend all your energy and your funds and your resources in that moment in time, because maybe the timing is wrong or maybe it's right. But that plays a crucial role.
And even on that topic, do you think that sometimes uh, people get, or which one do you think is like the biggest issue? I would say that people also can get stuck in saying that things are always going to be this way, and then they don't look into the future. Like, which one do you think is the more critical issue, and what advice would you give for that one?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Bill Gates once said that people overestimate the impact of technology in the short term and underestimate it in the long term. And I think if we apply that to startups, it's also true. In other words, when you do a startup, you overestimate at the beginning the impact of your actions, this marketing campaign that you're doing, this business model, this feature, this etc. And we expect immediate results. They don't happen and we get desperate. But over time, the cumulative impact of what we're doing all of a sudden starts being felt and being manifested. And all of a sudden, things start working much faster than we ever expected. So I think it's also true with startups. Don't overestimate how quickly things will happen in the short term, and don't underestimate how important the impact of what you're doing will be in the long term, if that makes sense.
No, for sure. It's good to have the solid foundation because, like you were talking about before, when you're starting a startup, you're always like so happy you have like this brilliant idea, and then you're like, this is gonna take off in like 2 months. We're gonna, make the exit for the $1 billion.
There are a few businesses like that. One could argue that Facebook, when it started in that Harvard dorm, was kind of like that. But I think those are the exceptions. That's very
Not the rule.
right.
Perfect. And just because I have you here for a few more minutes, there was two questions that I really was curious about your opinion for. Of course, everybody wants to talk about AI and the future of AI, and we touched on it a little bit. But what do you think the future of work is going to look like with the implementation of AI in the next few years?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think anybody really knows the answer, but when I think of AI and its impact on society, I look back at classical Greece. Now, during the period of classical Greece, and the ratio of slaves to free persons was 10 to 1. That meant that most of the population of Athens were slaves. Same thing for Sparta. Now, slavery is a horrible thing. I'm not a proponent of it by any shape but if you think about it, that's kind of similar to a society in which you have AI as your servant. And what happened in classical Greece? There was this flourishing of drama and philosophy and science and literature. It was a fantastic period in terms of creativity and knowledge and all that. So I think something like that could be what happens with AI, in the sense that all the mundane tasks that we don't like to do, if we analyze our typical workday as an employee or as a founder or as a CEO, it doesn't matter. Most of our time is spent on things that are not that enjoyable. And occasionally you get those periods where you get energized. So does an activity energize you, or does an activity drain your energy, right? I'd say that most of what we do, it probably drains our energy, and then occasionally there's things that we do that energize us, right? I think in the future, most of what we do will be energizing because all the mundane stuff will be taken care of by AI. Now, that's a very optimistic take on the future, and I hope I'm right. Um, but I'm also cognizant of the fact that AI also there could be a very dystopian future. But I'm an optimist.
No, for sure. I like to hear the optimistic side because I a lot of times I get the pessimistic side, and I mean there's definitely the factor of that, but if you there's two ways that you can look at it, and like you said, uh, one of the ones that I hear the most for the optimistic side is the fact that we can start moving into more creative domains, and I think that that's like one of the most exciting things too. That the mundane, tedious tasks um, get uh, get delegated, and we can have more time for creativity.
Yeah, I can tell you that as a business manager, I'm encouraging all my employees to use AI in their work, to find
Mm.
use cases, and we're not looking at AI as a substitute for human beings.
Mm.
What we're looking at AI is as a way of empowering human beings to be much more productive. So um, if AI is capable of doing a lot of the work that our engineers do right now, coding, that's not going to make us reduce our headcount in our engineering department. What it's going to do is make us much faster at delivering new applications, new features, etc., and thus growing much more quickly. So yeah, it's the cup half full, half empty type of thing.
Yeah, and even just squeezing one more question before I get into the last one, um, is I was an engineer like three years ago, and what got me like so curious was like the role of junior developers as well, because I just hear so many people saying that junior developers that they're going to be obsolete because of AI and co-pilots that are out there. What's your take on that one?
Well, I would say if you analyze that and you say, okay, does that mean then that junior developers are obsolete, but senior developers are not? And if that's the case, where are senior developers going to come from? Because nobody's born into this world as a senior developer. At some point, they were a junior developer. So I don't think that model works. I mean, what it may mean is that junior developers all of a sudden become as productive and as impactful as senior developers because they have AI backing them up. And senior developers now become as productive and impactful as software architects or engineering leads, et cetera, et cetera. So um, unless the question is, will AI completely eliminate the entire profession of software development, which I don't see happening. Um, but if you just say, well, just this part of software development is going to become obsolete, yes and no. Yes, because their current job is going to be done by AI, but no, because they're going to be the ones telling the AI to do their current job and having as much impact as what a senior developer does today. Does that make sense?
No, it definitely does, and I've been out of the developing game for just a couple of years now, and I'm like, it's like that would have been a scary thing if I was like coming out of school, and then you're like, oh yeah, but your diploma is it doesn't matter because we have AI to take over. But you're right. Like, how does the pyramid work? Uh, how did the senior engineers come to be? And it just expedites a few things and delegates a few tasks that were tedious and that you originally needed, like a senior engineer to be beside a junior engineer to be helping them, right? But now you can have that senior engineer be doing other tasks and giving the co-pilot that would have been the senior engineer to the
Exactly.
junior engineer.
And and that applies to other fields. For example, marketing, content marketing. Somebody who's working in content marketing. I mean, nowadays you can produce through AI uh, in a matter of seconds, this very compelling read. Does that mean that the profession of content marketing goes away? No. What it means is that we're going to be producing a lot more content. At least
Yeah,
that's what we're saying.
no, I love that. And just the question for the last 5 minutes that I have you is, If you could go back in time, what advice would you give your 25-year-old self?
Yeah. Well, one piece of advice would be to uh, remember that timing is important. So you can be too late, but you can also be too early, and it's very difficult to get that right. So if you find something is not working, try to analyze: is it because it can never work, it will never work, or is it because the time is not quite right? I'll go back to an example: the iPad, very successful product of Apple. It was actually invented about 15 years before it was launched. It was called the Newton, and it was invented by Apple, and it was a complete failure. But the concept was, this screen that you carried around. It had this intelligent pen, and it could do all these tasks. But it was a commercial flop. Why? Because at that time, wireless data was not really a thing. And at that time, touch sensitive LCD screens was not really a thing. So a lot of the environmental factors that needed to be in place for the iPad and the iPhone to be successful were not there yet. So if I'm a 25-year-old and I just invented the Newton and I'm trying to sell it and I'm not able to sell it, I have to ask myself, is it because I don't have the resources? Is it because I'm targeting the wrong purchaser or the wrong user? What are the reasons? Or is it because the environment that would support this has not yet appeared? And based on the answers, then I can adopt my strategy, which may mean simply take a much less ambitious approach, go for niche applications, and wait for the environment to catch up with your idea.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. And a lot of times, especially if you're like a 25-year-old, and I guess you're pretty early on in your career and in your life, is there like a best way to figure that stuff out? Is it just an experience thing? Is that just you have to ask people that are smarter than you, that have been in this industry longer than you? Is there a certain strategy to figure this out?
That's a tough one. I it's always difficult to get right the balancing of two things, which is resilience, hanging in there. As Rudyard Kipling said, if you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, so if you have an idea, everybody thinks it's going nowhere, but you have faith in that idea and you're sure that you're right. But you also want to be flexible, and you want to change direction if that needs to be done. So getting the balance right between flexibility, i.e. the ability to pivot, and perseverance, not giving up in the face of adversity, getting the balance right between those two things is very, very tough. If you're young, that does not make you less intelligent than somebody who's old. Far from it. Probably the reverse. But listening to other points of view is always a plus. Uh, I, I think one final thought on that is all human beings are constantly making mistakes. I like to tell my employees, if you're not making a mistake, you're not doing your job. You're not working. Making mistakes is part of the flow of work. I also like to tell my employees, if you make the same mistake twice, you're not doing your job correctly. So, talking to people and having them point out flaws in your business model, in your pricing model, in your marketing, go-to-market strategy, etc., great. At the end of the day, you have to make the call. You have to go with what you think is right, but get as much data points as you can before making that decision from people who can see your blind spots.
Perfect. And I think having the humility too is something that's very difficult.
Yes, yes, it is.
Even for myself, I can say it's tough because when you think that like this is your baby, this is like your business, and nobody can talk bad about it. It's tough to like um, let that humility come in, because sometimes it feels like it's a part of you too, and sometimes a part of you has to be humbled.
Yes, being humble is a very good leadership character trait.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, Alejandro, thank you so much for taking out a piece of your time to speak with me. I really appreciate it. I've
Thank,
learned so much from this, and
thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
yeah, thanks for having you on, and hopefully we can chat soon, and
Hope so.
we'll be in contact. Thanks so
Thank,
much, Alejandro.
thanks. Bye bye.
Bye.